Today I'm speaking to Carl Benjamin, also known as Sargon of Akkad. Carl, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You've been pretty busy. You're one of the biggest podcasters on the other side of the Atlantic. You've been very outspoken. You've been talking about the importance of a Donald Trump re-election. And you've also been very involved in something called Uniting the Kingdom, a movement designed to mobilize support in Britain. Could you talk to me a little bit about that? First of all, Uniting the Kingdom. What is it for an American audience, and why is it so important? And what's been your role in Uniting the Kingdom?
So, this might be something that Americans can relate to. It's become evident that the native British population have become a second class form of citizen in Britain in the past few years. This has always been something that has occurred for the last since about 1997 when Tony Blair brought in the neoliberal paradigm under which the progressive neoliberal paradigm under which we live. There has always been an essence of a kind of a whiff of being second class about the working class in Britain. But even, I mean, obviously, long before that, there was that essence. But this became very sharply highlighted in around 2011 with the grooming gang phenomenon, when it became very apparent that white working class girls, English girls in particular, had been taken advantage of by mostly Muslim grooming gangs where they'd been trafficked and raped and prostituted, uh, not with the permission of the authorities, but with the authorities turning a blind eye and occasionally being complicit in this. And everyone was outraged because, of course, this is a horrific thing to do to anyone, let alone to do to teenage girls on a near industrial scale. And even now, there's still a sense that it's kind of wrong to talk about it, and you're kind of stigmatizing the Muslim community by bringing this up. And this sense of being a second class citizen has just intensified with the advent of a new Labour government, because at least the Conservative Party tried not to make it obvious. But with Keir Starmer and his Labour Party, it's become very obvious that any kind of working class sentiment, native British, particularly English sentiment, is quote unquote far right. And after the Southport stabbings, Keir Starmer, on the very day that the riots happened, because for anyone who doesn't know, a second generation Rwandan man stabbed for some reason that we're not entirely sure of, but he was found with Al Qaeda terrorist materials in his house. He went to a Taylor Swift themed dance school where a bunch of young girls were doing dancing and stabbed eight of them, killing three of them. And people were outraged. People, without any evidence at the time, thought that it may have been an Islamic terror attack because this kind of thing has happened before. The worst event being the Manchester Arena bombing, which was an Ariana Grande concert. And there were many riots across the country. Now, many of these targeted mosques, but at the time it wasn't self evident this was actually an Islamic terror attack because, of course, Rwanda is not an Islamic country. This man was the descendant of Rwandan immigrants, so why might that have been the case? But it seems at the moment that he may well have done, somehow radicalized while in Britain by downloading Al Qaeda terror manuals or whatever. But this information has only come out recently. At the time, that wasn't available, although the government probably was well aware that that was the case. And anyway, Keir Starmer had declared that everyone involved in these riots was far right, which is to politicize them. These weren't an expression of fear or anger or grief or just the perennial kicking of the dog that's finally biting back. No, this was an ideological question of politics, and therefore Keir Starmer, being far left, was in opposition to this nebulous far right and promised that they would be criminalized as swiftly as the courts were able. And the courts were running 24 hours a day in order to get these people in jail. Now, the lawyers that these people were appointed, and I guarantee these people were appointed lawyers, because when they would tell us who the people were that were being arrested, it was bricklayer or shopkeeper or someone very normal, someone with whom interaction with the law is not normally an everyday occurrence. So they themselves don't have a lawyer and have probably never seen the inside of a courtroom. And so the court-appointed lawyers that were assigned to them had obviously told them all, look, just plead guilty and you get a minimal sentence. And so every single one of these people, over 1,000 of them, pled guilty, and they're all in jail at the moment.
I mean,
One of them has committed suicide since.
that's one of the things that slightly perplexes me. We had the authorities clamp down on people who were perceived to take part in rioting, and a lot of them pleaded guilty and then got very, very stiff sentences. Some of them, I think, perhaps rightly so, but some of them merely for sort of sending out a slightly obnoxious tweet. Do you think they were encouraged? Do you think their legal counsel probably told them to plead guilty, and they were perhaps not given the best advice in their best interest at the time?
I think there's no doubt. I mean, I'm very, very doubtful that any of them had any of their own legal counsel. I can only imagine that it was given to them by the state, and I think that a lot of these people probably couldn't have afforded legal counsel either. This was a working class uprising because these are the people living cheek by jowl with the diversification of the country, and it seems that they were advised to simply plead guilty, even though some of them had really done nothing wrong. One chap was given 2 years, 8 months for shouting at the police. I don't think shouting at the police is actually a jailable offence. I suppose that in the context of being in a riot, maybe, but even then, that's crazy. And I think that a pretty good defence could have been mounted by a competent lawyer. Say, well, look, this person hasn't actually broken any laws. He hasn't actually committed any crimes. And there were some people, of course, who do deserve to go to jail for crimes they committed. I mean, there were people throwing bricks at the police. There were people who were trying to set hotels on fire that were housing migrants. Right. So,
and incitement. I mean, if you
sure,
use your freedom to say things to incite other people, that's a clear offence. Yeah.
Absolutely, but there were definitely people who'd posted on social media or who'd just been present but not doing something themselves, who still went to jail even though it wasn't really justified. And so this looked overbearing from the government, and it looked like the political environment was very hot, and it would have been a sensible thing for Keir Starmer to recognize that he was the prime minister of the entire country and say, I understand that you're very hurt at the moment. I understand that tempers are going very high, and I understand this is a pattern of behavior that you are responding to. This isn't an incident in isolation. This is something that has been racking communities for decades now. Calm down, go home. We are going to prosecute the people who have committed crimes, who have tried to set fire to hotels and things like that. But we are on your side because we are the government. But instead, Keir Starmer anathematized these people, stigmatized them as being far right, and told them essentially their political concerns were beyond the pale and would not receive redress from the government. And this has led people to realize that the informal two-tier system that went unspoken when Labour Party councillors and the local police in Rotherham and Rochdale and wherever would turn a blind eye and just say, well, I just don't see what's happening with the grooming gangs, and one Labour report said, quote, this is a lifestyle choice from those 13-year-old girls, things like that. That order had been reified into something that was actually concrete. No, you are far right, and we are against you, says the government. And this is the real energy that has caused the Uniting the Kingdom rallies to be such the phenomenal successes that they've been. So the rallies themselves are. I don't want to play into the framing of the media on this, because it would be easy to say, well, these are far right rallies, and these are people who have been locked out of mainstream political discourse because they don't agree with the far left paradigm that has taken over. And this paradigm is stigmatizing us as far right. But actually, we're mostly just very normal people. There is a surprisingly high number of fathers and husbands in this movement who are very upset that actually our wives and children are being put increasingly in danger. And when we want redress and an accounting of this from the state, we are in fact told we're not entitled to it, and somehow we are just worthy of less consideration, less grace than other communities. We're taxpayers. We deserve as many rights as everyone else.
The great promise of a multicultural Britain was always that everyone would be treated equally. Do you think that what we're seeing now is a realization that actually there isn't equality, what a multicultural society in a postmodern, the hands of a postmodern elite means is that people are treated very differently. And after years of white people in England and Scotland and Ireland and Wales being almost told that they are the problem, we're starting to see a reaction to that, a sort of the emergence of what you might call a sort of ethno-nationalist identity almost. Is that, would you agree with that analysis?
Um, Broadly, yes, but I would be careful about the kind of terminology I was using, because the people involved in the movement are not ethno-nationalists, in the strict sense. To say they don't like or respect people of races other than their own is that's not correct, and that's definitely not the feeling. The movement itself, again, is not racially um, prejudiced or privileging. There are lots of people who are not native white Britons involved in it,
Mhm.
but who are people who are not inside the woke coalition that have grasped hold of the country. And so to delineate it on racial lines would not be correct. It's more lines of sentiment. It's more about what people feel against what the government feels. So the people in the United Kingdom rally feel particular and attached to Britain. They feel that they are of Britain, they are a part of Britain, the Britain that people of our age would remember as children. And they want that Britain to persist into the future. And of course, what we're looking at is essentially a kind of continuation of the French Revolution by Keir Starmer and the Labour Party,
Mhm.
and frankly, the Conservative Party. Um, and that is something that is substantively different to what came before. But it also renders people in different categories to what came before. Again, like note the framing ethno-nationalist. Well, I mean, what does that even mean? Each nation is based on an ethnos, otherwise you don't have a nation. And so any civic identity that you would have that would be nationalistic would be predicated on an ethnos, which we are trying to somehow split out. So these categories don't really make sense. What this more resembles is more like an occupied tribe that is trying to assert itself against its occupier. The occupiers being the sort of global hegemony of the liberal ideal, and the tribe being the ancient settled peoples of this land, and that can also include people who have been born and raised here who aren't ethnically English, Welsh, Scottish, or Northern Irish, but they themselves are part of the tribe. They go to the pub with us. They marry into our families. They're a part of our communities, and they feel like they belong here. And I think that's really the key thing is those people who genuinely feel like they belong don't want to institute a two-tier society
It's
because that would be wrong.
it's not really ethno-nationalism. It's more a case of what you might call British or English exceptionalism. This idea that there is something distinctive and unlike any other country in Britain, just as there may be something distinctive and unique in France or Japan or wherever. And that actually, if you wish to be part of that country, if you want the citizenship, you need to accept that exceptionalism and
Mm.
you need to renounce the idea of interchangeability. Is that, would you say that's a
Yeah,
better
that's definitely a part of it. Particularism is definitely the
particular?
core sentiment at the heart of the United Kingdom rally, but it's not exclusive to Englishness. Although I think that the question of English identity really is one that whose time has come. You'll see a suite of national flags at these rallies from all over the world. Actually, we've got simply the international nationalist movement
I
is
saw an
definitely.
Israeli one, and I saw
Yeah.
a Scottish one and a Welsh one. It's
Yep.
much more than just Englishness. Yeah.
It is, but it's not to say that the English aren't the majority of it because they're taking place in England, so it's a geographic convenience and nothing else. But I think it's also because the question of an English identity is important at this point, but it's not in opposition to other identities.
Mhm.
Other identities are just as valid. It is a Scottish identity, a French identity, a Welsh identity, an Israeli identity. These are all just as valid, and the same principles that these people hold when they fly their national flags are what's underpinning when the English come out and fly their national flag. So this is an alliance that you're seeing between people who hold patriotic sentiments to their own country and their own peoples, and it's very wholesome. It's the atmosphere there is like a giant family day out. Frankly, there's nothing. Again, when you start using sort of hard categories, sort of ethno-nationalist stuff like that, it's such it definitely doesn't accurately describe what's really happening because this is a big community event.
I want to in a moment really delve into this because I'm changing a lot of my long-standing opinions about a lot of things. Partly because I look at what's happening back in the old country, partly because I'm living in a new country, and many of the assumptions that I grew up with about what you might call a sort of liberal nationalist outlook on the world, I'm starting to sort of question them, and I'd love to sort of dig down a bit deeper into some of these things. But before we do that, another really big thing on the horizon is U.S. politics. You've been very outspoken in support of Donald Trump. I live in the United States. I'm very conscious of the fact I'm a guest in another person's country, and I don't like to pontificate about how people over here should vote. But I'm fascinated to talk to people who know for sure that they would want Donald Trump to win. Why are you so pro Donald Trump? What is it about Donald Trump that appeals to you as a Brit?
There is Donald Trump has recently been saying that America is an occupied country, and in a way he is right. The same as England, France, Germany, Canada, Australia, all of the West. There is a kind of intellectual or ideological occupation that we summarize in the term globalism. And when we say globalism, what we mean is not foreign peoples, actually. What we mean is the idea that there should be an international rules based order that supersedes national sovereignty and the will of any national electorate. And this is usually identified with being synonymous with Davos and the World Economic Forum and the people who frequent that. Although there's not a conspiracy or anything like that. This is just a kind of aligning of beliefs. And so you can see those people who are part of it very clearly by the kind of people that they associate with. I mean, Keir Starmer will just tell you that he prefers Davos to Westminster, which is a remarkable admission, frankly. Perfect. Thank you for telling us. We know Westminster being the parochial national parliament of Britain, Davos being the kind of capital of this international agreement that's happening. And so in Trump, what I see is a personification of a kind of metaphorical American. Right? He is an archetypal American. If you were to ask AI to draw me an American, it wouldn't go far wrong if it told you, well, here's Donald Trump. That's an American. He is very much the American. In fact, in very much to foreign people as well. Donald Trump just exemplifies. He exudes Americana.
Yeah, yeah. Self-made man, full of confidence, optimism. But here's the thing, Carl. You talk about countries being occupied, and you, I think, quite rightly say it's not a conspiracy. Would one way of looking at it perhaps be to say that the globalist elite, instead of trying to describe it by Davos and institutions, describe it as a sort of intellectual disease, postmodernism, the idea that there's no such thing as absolute truth, and therefore, by extension, there's no such thing as a better culture or a better way of life than any other, and a belief that people are interchangeable. Perhaps what's really the army of occupation in the West are not so much people who go to Davos, it's people who spend too long at Western universities and come out infected by this postmodern mindset. I mean, I'm fascinated to ask you of all people, because you describe yourself as a postmodern traditionalist. So I'd love to hear, I'd love to know why you describe yourself as that, and to what extent you think that postmodernism is the root cause of our Western ailment.
Well, this dovetails quite well with why I'm such a vociferous supporter of Donald Trump, because Donald Trump embodies a kind of spirit of America that I think is important in the face of what you're describing. And what you're describing really is the most advanced stage of liberalism yet. Liberalism, for anyone who knows, has changed over the centuries but there's been a kind of essence that's not changed. And that essence has been to try and assume or try and revert mankind back to its original primordial state before it became a social creature, which of course never existed. There was never a time when mankind was not a
Is that
social animal.
liberalism or isn't that Rousseauism? Isn't that Jacobinism? That's not quite
Well,
the same as liberalism, is it?
these are all liberal philosophies. Actually, they all come from the same liberal root that begins in the thought experiment of the state of nature, that assumes that man chose to enter into society, and therefore we can make of society anything we want. And what comes along with that thought experiment is, and Rousseau was particularly good on this, the necessary realization that, well, there must have been a pre-social man then, if man came into society to form himself as he's chosen. And that means that anything that was socially given to man, such as your habits, your customs, your beliefs, your language, your laws, your habits, the way that you inflect, all sorts of
Behavior,
things,
behavioral
all
traits.
of these things that are socially given to you, well, if you remove all of them, then what you have arrived at is a universal type of man, a universal pre-social human that could have fit in anywhere, and this, what we would call, broadly speaking, blank slatism.
Okay.
All men are the same until they're placed into a society, and then they turn out different.
And to be clear,
Um,
the antithesis of this is the idea that your behavioral traits are not a product of your environment and perhaps even culture, but perhaps your behavioral traits may be innate. Your
correct.
um,
Yes.
time preferences may be innate. Fascinating. I want to really get into this because go ahead.
Yeah.
I think this is really key.
Yeah. Well, this is the seed of liberalism. This is the core um, contention of liberalism. Is that fundamentally, at bottom, we are all the same. We are all of the same human matter and the same human type. And there is something to this. I mean, all humans want to eat, sleep, reproduce, stay in a house, have pleasures, have leisure time. There are certain universal human characteristics, but there are also many, many, many more particular characteristics that are not universal, that are not shared with all mankind. There are many different ways of thinking that we don't even realize just how differently the way that our language is structured. Like the English language in particular is structured to place blame, whereas many other languages are not structured, and many European languages are not structured in such a way as to place blame. So when something happens, the first thing you and I think as Englishmen is, well, who's responsible for that? But actually, many languages don't have a kind of sense of individual responsibility. They don't
So you're
directly
saying
point the finger.
that the language indicates an underlying thought process or lack of thought process in some cases.
Well, we can only think in the language that we have. And so if your language doesn't contain certain concepts, you can't really have those thoughts. And so there's just and this is an entire can of worms. I wasn't trying to open, but it's not just the language; it's the unspoken assumptions of your culture. It's the laws that you expect to see in place. It's the way that you expect people to react to certain kinds of behaviors. All of these things are all completely different. And the main problem that liberalism has, it says, well, okay, if people are all the same, then we can just bring in infinite numbers of foreigners and they'll just become just like us, because ultimately human beings are basically all the same. But the problem with that is that, well, let's assume the state of nature thought experiment was real, even though it wasn't. Yes, in that situation, if we could find an atomized man wandering around in the woods, we would agree that he has no social training and therefore he is an undifferentiated human type. But none of those people exist. Every single person on this planet has grown up in a society, and therefore they have, since their birth, and right through their childhood and right into their adulthood, inculcated into themselves a set of traits and expectations and moral values and linguistic techniques to conceive the world and to understand the world that are unique to that place, time, and people. Right? People, even if the liberal conceit was correct, which it's not, and I'm going to keep stressing that, it's just wrong. Even if it was correct, though, it's too late. All of these people are adults and they will not be like us.
Now, the left has traditionally said that insofar as there are differences in behavioral traits, for example, insofar
Mhm.
as some people might be more prone towards criminality than others, it's a condition of their environment, or
Mhm.
they might even say because socioeconomic deprivation.
Mhm.
Um, the conservative movement, or rather the conservative movement to which I have belonged for most of my adult life, although I'm not sure if I'm still part of it, has often said that yes, there may be different behavioral traits, but there's a cultural explanation for this. Might there be not an environmental explanation for this or a cultural explanation for it, but something else that explains different behavioral traits between different societies around the world?
It is possible, although I'm wary of getting into this field of thought because there's something about it I really don't like very much. Uh, I'm very much against determinism.
Mm-hmm.
I actually do think that we are rational agents who are in control of our thought process and then for behaviors. Even if most of the time we don't do that much that is actually rational. Like I went and got a drink from the fridge and I didn't spend any time deliberating over the drink I was going to get. I just got the one that habitually I would get at this point to carry on with. So even if we don't do that many rational things in a day, we are still capable of rationality and should do when the opportunity is most pressing.
But,
And so there is going there are a few difficult facts that the left has to deal with and that we have to deal with in this. And one of those facts is that we are biological creatures. So everything that we do ultimately has a genetic basis. But the easy answer would then be to say, well, that means that everything is genetically determined and we had no real agency involved in it. But then we've arrived at a position that's very similar to the left that also doesn't really take account to what a human being is in total. And
yeah,
so that isn't sorry, that is an aspect of things, but another aspect of things is how we were born and raised, how we grew up, what the stimuli around us, the incentives and disincentives were, and how we were treated, and how our character was molded. And then we come to the sort of third section of this, which is in the moment moral decision making, rational decision making, which we are actually all capable of. And so that all of these things play an important part. And so, yes, there may well be differences in the genetic human type of person, but there are also differences in the habituation of those people. And there are also differences in the environment in which those people find themselves, even if they're sharing the same space. Because, as I said, we are living in a two-tier society. Now, for example, one of the major problems that we have in Britain and in America as well is permissiveness towards ethnic minorities when they commit crimes.
what do you mean?
This well, take for example, I mean, you could take the grooming gangs, or you could take the smash and grab raids that are happening in places like California and New York and in London, where the authorities don't really want to intervene in this. This is sort of treated as a kind of natural occurrence, like a flash flood or something. And so, I mean, in California, what they decided to do is just make it not a felony to steal less than $1,000 worth of equipment from a shop, which is just crazy. And so now shops are shutting down, and everyone's like, "Why are shops shutting down?" It's like, well, because they're being stolen from on a regular basis. What is wrong with you? What are we even talking about here? Why are we having this conversation? Why are you treating these people as if they can't do anything other than steal? Now, the way that we are approaching this is completely backwards, and it's just going to encourage criminality because actually those people aren't stupid. They know that they shouldn't be stealing, and they know that for some reason we're showing profound weakness when it comes to them committing crimes. And they can see that the white people aren't doing that, but they know that if they do it, they're not going to get in trouble. So they do it fearlessly for some reason. I mean, they probably don't know why we're so weak on this, but knowing that we're just not going to do anything. And that's really quite counterproductive, isn't it? Because if we were just to punish them as we would punish anyone else, and I would want any person of any kind of race to be punished for stealing from a shop, for example. If we were to punish them with the same amount of enthusiasm with which we'd punish anyone else, this would not happen. They would learn that they would be punished and they would stop doing it, or at least the level of it would be much, 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 much lower than it is at the moment. Shops wouldn't feel the need to lock up all of their goods and have you go around and request that from an assistant. That wouldn't be the case because it wasn't the case when we punished without fear or favor, but we don't do that anymore. And we don't do that for politically correct reasons, for reasons of liberal ideology. And so, even if there are biological differences, which it's entirely possible that there are, the way that we are raising people or allowing them to be raised, and the way that we are then interfacing with them when they're a part of society is massively and disproportionately causing or allowing criminality to manifest when it just doesn't have to be this way. We just need to have the courage of our convictions that, well, actually, when you do this, regardless of the kind of person that you are punished for that.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you for that. I mean, I'm really interested in this idea that multi um, cultural European societies where you've had mass immigration is increasingly being recognized as a disaster, as a catastrophe. Now, I remember 20, 30 years ago, people would talk proudly about, Britain being, I think the patronizing word they would talk about is saying Britain is becoming a vibrant society. Um, Actually, it seems pretty obvious to me that we're starting to see some big failures associated with mass immigration. Just to give some viewers in the United States some context, I think I'm right in saying that 1 in every 25 people in Britain today has arrived within the past 2 years. Something like 50% of all social housing, government housing in London, now has a foreign-born person living in it. In Denmark and in Holland, some surveys have been done that show in Holland that certain migrants coming from the Middle East and North Africa, at no point in their career trajectories in aggregate are they ever net contributors to the system. They're always a net drain on the system. The idea that migration is good for the economy, well, that's just demonstrably not true if it's migrants from certain parts of North Africa and the Middle East in countries like Holland. In Denmark, a really fascinating study looked at rates of criminality amongst Danish-born but second-generation migrants from around the world, and found an extraordinary high number of people, males, had committed criminal offences by the age of 30. What's fascinating is not only that this undermines the whole idea that migration must be good, but it very clearly shows that migration from some parts of the world is good. Migrants, Hindu migrants from India, very, very low levels of criminality, very, very high levels of fiscal contribution to an economy. Migrants from other parts of the world, particularly the Horn of Africa, economic negative, cultural negative. To what extent do you think this is now being widely understood by policymakers in Britain and Europe?
If there's any understanding of this by policymakers, I've yet to see any evidence of it. I can't think in any way, shape, or form. I mean, for example, in Britain, um, after Brexit, we used to take a lot of European migrants, and one of the primary reasons that people voted for Brexit was to simply stop migration or reduce migration
Take
to
back control?
manageable.
Yeah.
Take back control, reduce it to manageable levels. And for some reason, Boris Johnson took the opportunity to take massive numbers of third world migrants instead of Europeans, which wasn't what people were asking for, and has, as you pointed out, a detrimental economic and social effect. I think people forget that we are very open and permissive societies, and people who come from societies which are not open and permissive, well, their society, they're used to having a firm hand above them at all times. This is a part of their moral worldview. They expect there to be a firm hand above them at all times. And when there's not, this is seen to them to not only be weakness, but permission to do these things.
Mm-hmm.
Like again, it's a totally different philosophy. Like I was saying earlier, I don't know about the biological side of things, so I try to avoid that. But philosophically, it's very clear that they view us as weak. They view us as a soft touch, and they assume that they have been brought here to do these things. Why else would it be that we let these people in and then essentially say you can commit any crime you want, and we're not really going to punish you? And when we do punish you, you'll be punished less than the native population. If they weren't, what this telegraphs to them is the signal that, look, you are more important than the native population, and actually we want you to do what you're doing. That's what they take from it. It's not somehow a coincidence to them. They don't they're not disconnected from this. They're plugged into the internet. They know what's happening. They can see and make judgments of their own. And so, if we wanted multiculturalism to work, which I presumably would mean we bring in foreign people and they get jobs and they live according to our laws and they become as much like Englishmen or Brits as possible, then we would have a very um, overbearing part of the state that would be focused on their life, and we would be hand holding them through that process. We wouldn't just be saying, "Oh, yeah, you're free to roam across Britain or America now. Good luck. I hope you fit in." We wouldn't be doing that because, and they would think that we shouldn't be doing that if that's what we wanted, and so they can only assume they're here for reasons other than integration, which is why they're not integrated.
Mhm. I mean, and another thing that I start to think about is that there may be differences between different societies and different groups within society in terms of, say, for example, levels of conscientiousness. Now, I've listened to a lot to Jordan Peterson and very struck by the importance of conscientiousness as a factor that determines not only an individual's achievements in life, but a group's and a society's achievements. I mean, economists have long understood the idea of time preferences. It's one of those areas of economics that's long overlooked, but I actually think it's probably the most important area of economics. Just for the benefit of listeners, a time preference is an economist's way of explaining the bargain we make as individuals with our future selves. If you've got a productive time preference, you're the kind of person who will save money and not go out this weekend in order to have a productive week ahead, and maybe spend long years studying as a poor student in order to acquire the skills needed to go on and have a physician's salary. So if you've got good time preferences, productive time preferences, you generally are conscientious. If you've got poor time preferences, you're the sort of person who might, for example, risk mugging someone for £100 because you're willing to risk your future self going to jail. So economists talk about time preferences. One of the things that I wonder is if you have large numbers of people coming into countries like Germany and Britain and Scandinavia, countries, host societies that generally have extraordinarily productive time preferences, I think perhaps reflected by their per capita GDPs historically and their high levels of innovation and contribution to science, etc. If you bring in large numbers of people with very poor time preferences and low levels of conscientiousness, you're not really going to create an egalitarian multicultural utopia. You're just not. It's extraordinarily naive that we ever thought that you might.
Yeah, yeah, no, you're of course absolutely correct. Um, I mean, for example, the sort of Germanic countries are extremely conscientious, and anyone who's traveled around Europe will be able to see the difference between going to Germany and France, for example, when it comes to levels of politeness, or if you've ever tried to drive around the Mediterranean in Italy or Greece, perhaps you notice there's a level of difference between their conscientiousness on the roads compared to the Danes, for example. Things are incredibly different everywhere, frankly, and you are absolutely correct. In retrospect, it seems wildly optimistic at best to suggest that we could just cram millions and millions of people from all over the world into one place and just assume that everything will just work itself out because we're all fundamentally the same.
Are you trying to suggest that perhaps meritocracy? I mean, there was a time when the UK perhaps wasn't as meritocratic as it is today, but meritocracy is not a universal cultural value. It's quite specific not only to Western cultures, but perhaps subsets within Western culture, Scandinavian and British and to some extent American culture.
I think it's there's a kind of yes and no to that. So there are no universal values. No value is universally held. Um, Again, this is a liberal conceit that's just not true. Right? Not everyone agrees that this, that, and the other the things we think are good are good. But also the question, and this is where the postmodern part comes in, the question of what is meritocratic is at stake, actually. Because I can't help but notice that what you're naming are Protestant countries, the Germanic Protestant work ethic that means that's based around productivity and competence. And so that's an assumed value that we project outwards onto the world, and we just assume, well, everyone wants competence and diligence and someone who is capable and well educated to do this thing. Well, not necessarily. We have very individualistic societies that in previous generations were very high trust and worked on a very advanced and very well developed property law, contract law. And that's very particular to us. Mediterranean societies aren't like this. They don't have the kind of atomized families that we have. Our children leave home a lot earlier than all of the Mediterranean countries, sometimes by about a decade or so. And it's the same in other countries. I mean, one of the phenomenon that we've noticed in Britain in the modern day, and this came up in COVID, was multiple generation households. We've got 3 or 4 generations of Pakistanis living in the same household. And everyone's like, oh God, that means COVID's going to rip through them and do severe harm to the elderly. Yeah, that is something that happened, but that's because they live in a different way to us that we don't understand. And so they have a much more sort of tribal experience of the world where a much more clannish experience of the world. We've got sort of extended families that live in close proximity and rely upon each other in ways that we as Westerners don't and don't really understand. And so when we say merit, to us, that means someone who is trustworthy, hardworking, reliable, arrives on time, things like that, and will deal with others in the same way. Well, to a culture like that, merit doesn't mean that. Merit means being loyal to the family. Merit means making sure that the grandfather is taken care of, making sure that the children are watched or looked after, or making sure they have employment and things like that, to make sure they have a way of providing their own food and for the larger family. And so we just have a different way of living that is not the same. And so to say merit as if it's a universal value, no, it means different things to different people.
So much of what we've just been talking about will be so outrageously offensive to so many people. This brings me on to the point that I really want to get your thoughts on. Do you think that if Western society is going to survive, we need, in the manner of a better immune system, a different moral code, one that not only allows us to discuss these things, but which allows us to recognize genuine differences and to recognize that different values between different cultures aren't just a case of what kind of street food you have or what kind of drums you beat on your national day, but that they speak to something more fundamental and more profound. Do you think we need an alternative, a new moral code to sort of postmodernism, almost a postmodernist moral code? And if you do think that, I'd love to start discussing with you what that new moral code for the West might look like.
We absolutely need a new moral code, and it's something I put a great deal of thought into. The problem is, it essentially has to repudiate all of liberalism's assumptions. And as we live in liberal democracies, and liberalism is the ruling creed of the Anglosphere, if not the West at large, that is a very tall order, because essentially what we are saying is the way that we have been imposing our moral rules on others is itself immoral, and this will feel like a very personal attack to many, many, many people in the West. And it will be very easy to say, nope, actually, everything you're saying is wrong. It's racist, it's xenophobic, it's whatever, the stigmatizing words they have. And I don't need to listen to it. Now, what they're not saying there is it's not true. They're not saying it's not true, because it is true. Everything that we've been saying here is completely true. What they're going to say is it is just unacceptable, because to the English speaking world, liberalism has the same kind of authority as Sharia law does to the Islamic world. It is the background radiation of our moral beliefs. We have real difficulty articulating a position that is not liberal. And since definitely the middle to late 20th century, there has just been no other moral framework for us to work within. Now, there used to be, if we go back 100 years or 200 years, we had a much more, I guess we would say, tribal belief system. We had our beliefs, but we accepted they weren't always the beliefs of others. And in fact, they were often repudiated by others. And we dealt with people on their own terms. So we said, well, look, this is for us and it works for us. This is how we believe. If you believe different, then we will have a rule for you that is not a rule for us. And you will have a rule for us that is not a rule for you. And we would have, I mean, the British Empire is famous for the tact with which it dealt with the various tribes and different
Indirect
ethnicities it
rule.
dealt with.
It's why a handful of district officers could run large tracts of the world. Indirect rule, yeah.
You are absolutely right. I mean, the British colonial army was something like 150,000 men. When you think about it, I mean, the Roman Empire's army was something like 350,000. So for us to be able to manage an area something like 4 times the size of the Roman Empire with a third of the men must have meant we were doing something correctly.
Yeah.
And I think it was this diplomatic tact of framing us as a tribe and framing them as a tribe, and then framing a unique relationship between those tribes, and then having lots of those happening with different communities was the secret to it, because the people being dealt with felt they were being dealt with on their own terms and fairly, rather than imposing a universal rule for all that now every size had to be squeezed into. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, very much so. Just before I start to go a little deeper into the new moral code, and I'm very aware that Nietzsche and others thought that Western philosophical traditions were leading us to a cul-de-sac and needed to be reinvented, and I'm not sure that was always a happy experience. Before we get into that, I just want to tease out this idea when you talk about liberalism. I want to put forward an alternative viewpoint, and I haven't really road tested this, so you might tell me why I'm wrong. Please tell me why I'm wrong. But if I'm not wrong, perhaps synthesis and antithesis, perhaps we can create something new. Instead of thinking of liberalism as the problem, maybe there are two parallel views of human nature. One is essentially that of Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes realized that, yes, we had been primitive in the past. Life was short, horrible, brutish, terrible, and there was progression possible. Now, Hobbes famously talked about the fact that it was a strong king, a strong Leviathan that made social order possible. I don't want to get into that. My point about Hobbes is, though, that he understood that we had started at the bottom in a horrible, primitivist, atavistic, barbarous past, and we had moved up. Against that, you have Rousseau, who I think is probably the most evil thinker of all time, who
wasn't a good man either.
He was a monstrous man, and the father of almost every sinful and abominable thought since. Rousseau's idea was the antithesis of Hobbes's. Instead of a progression, instead of going up the steps, he venerated the primitivism of the past, the noble savage, and he saw civilization almost as a regression. Now, if you think that human order is in decline, you invite people to come along with a horrible blueprint, whether it's Marxist or Jacobin or Nazi or eco-extremist. If you think that the human condition is deteriorating, you invite that sort of monstrous social intervention. I think what you describe as liberalism, this idea that we're a blank slate and our nature is conditioned by our environment and our circumstances, and that we can remake human beings and ultimately that
I didn't get that far. I'm not saying we can remake human beings or anything like that.
Okay. We can make ultimately the ultimate expression of Rousseau's idea, I think, is that you can make a man into a woman and a woman into a man.
Oh yeah. There's definitely. Sorry, I thought you were describing that to me rather than liberalism. Sorry.
But I'm not sure that is the same thought as Hobbes's idea, which I would say, the Hobbes strand of classical liberalism, I'm not sure should be tarred with the same brush as the Rousseau's idea, which I would hesitate to describe as liberal. So how would please tell me why I'm completely wrong on all of that.
Sure. I don't think it's accurate to characterize them as diametric opposites because they begin in the same place. They just interpret what that place would be like according to the different dispositions of the men doing the interpretation. So Hobbes was a much more grim figure, has a much darker worldview because he lived through the English Civil War. He saw lots of death and destruction and didn't like it. Rousseau was basically a Genevan layabout and a dandy who was smart enough to live by his pen and didn't take responsibility for anything, it seems, throughout his life. And so interpreted this same strand of idea. Because what's happening intellectually is a sort of 150-year long conversation that begins actually before Hobbes, but we can take Hobbes as a good starting point because Hobbes is mechanistic. Hobbes isn't appealing to anything idealistic. He's purely material. He's saying, well, man was running around in the woods and he made the conscious choice to enter into society, and therefore, whatever he follows, follows. The difference between Hobbes and Rousseau when it comes to the state of nature is that where Hobbes's savage man chooses to leave the state of nature, which is for Hobbes the state of war, where all man is the enemy to every other man. Rousseau believed that civilization was never consciously entered into. It was something that happened to man. For some reason, over time, men arrived in little villages and then in bigger cities, and then suddenly he's in a giant state and he's at the mercy of it. And so for Rousseau, man is a very waify, innocent, Garden of Eden dwelling inhabitant who's wandering around plucking fruit of trees and having a very nice time. But for Hobbes, had a much more realistic view of what man's life would have actually been like back then, if that had been the case. It was nasty, brutish, and short. And so it made rational sense to enter into it. And these interpretations of this same premise are the two different strands of liberalism that you're talking about. The Hobbesian and later on sort of Lockean view of classical liberalism is, of course, to the Anglo mind, much more preferable because it kind of post hoc rationalizes everything that we're already doing and it fits with our general moral sentiments. Yeah, we agree that obviously I made the decision of living my life the way I lived it, and therefore I take responsibility for that thing. And therefore, if I build a piece of property in the woods, as John Locke would point out, look, I've chopped down some trees, I've built myself a cabin, I own that because I mixed my labor with it, and therefore no one's got a right to take it away from me. And in fact, the point of the state is, in fact, to protect my private property. And this very English view of the world, view of the legitimacy of the state and of morality. But if you've got a different view, so for example, a sort of French view from Rousseau, you're the victim of society. And actually, why shouldn't I mean, Rousseau is trying to recreate the state to take on the aspect of nature so that everyone has everything provided to them through the state. And he has a particular line in the social contract that I think is very haunting, and anyone with any common sense should read this and go, right, okay, everything that comes after this is just wrong. He says, the aim of this is that man be maximally dependent on the state and minimally dependent on one another. Because he says at the beginning of the social contract, man is born free and is everywhere in chains. Well, the chains are his reliance and his relationships with his fellow man. And so the point being to break those chains, make someone maximally dependent on the state, because the point is to recreate the state of nature. The point of the social contract is to recreate the state of nature in society. That's what he's aiming for. And so the state has to take on the role of nature in this and be the provider of all of those natural things that man otherwise would have just plucked off the trees, allowing him to have minimal relations and obligations with his fellow man. That was the aim of what Rousseau was going for. But the problem is, what underpins this is the question of consent. It is assumed by liberalism that consent is the highest value. And if consent is the highest value, then anything to which you didn't consent is something that liberalism ultimately, may not initially, but ultimately will try to solve, will try to either break down, try to resolve, try to find a way out of. And you see this in Hobbes. He didn't consent to being born in the state of nature, and so he used his willpower to choose to go into society. Well, for Rousseau, he didn't consent to being in the society, and so we need to choose to instantiate a state that will make him as maximally free from his fellow man as possible. And you see this same thread that goes through all liberal philosophy to the modern day with wokeism. I didn't consent to be born in a man's body, therefore I should be able to choose to be a woman. I didn't consent to be born in the country I'm in, therefore I should choose to move to your country. Things like that. It's all predicated on the kind of imprisonment of the will within the physical self and the liberation of the will from that.
Okay, so say we repudiate the Rousseau strand of liberal thought.
Mhm.
Say, this big number one fan of John Locke repudiates the Lockeist strand of classical liberalism. We create or seek to create a new moral code.
Hmm.
I would argue that a new moral code needs to be built, number one, on a recognition that some ways of life are better, not just materially more productive, but more fulfilling and morally better than others. Would that be a good starting point for a new moral code?
So I'm concerned about the use of the term better because that implies that there is an objective standard to which we can appeal, which there might be. There may well we could choose an objective standard. Um, but that would also mean that if we didn't live up to that standard ourselves, then the leftist agitator would have us by our own rules in an Alinsky fashion and would essentially be able to sort of judo flip us with our own morality there. But also, it might be that someone else does what we want to a more effective degree. Maybe the Japanese do this better or something. And so we have to essentially concede that the Japanese are a superior culture to us and we should adapt and adopt almost everything that they do, which I think misses the point of our culture. Rather than the term better, I think maybe just preferential. It's ours, and I don't want to give it up. And I don't care if it's physically better or materially better than something else. This is spiritually how I think that we ought to live. And I don't, and this is why I'm a postmodern traditionalist. I'm not saying that this is a universal rule for all mankind. I'm saying that it's just for us, the English. This is how the English have been living for a long time, and we like it.
I get it. I mean, I'm approaching this or have been approaching this now by thinking which way of life produces the equivalent of the most gold medals at the Olympics.
Yeah.
How many satellites and per capita GDP and the rest of it. And what you're saying is, no, that's dangerous, because if you come across one society out there that is better at those measures than you are, you admitted that you delegitimized your exceptionalism. What you're saying is that it's the exceptionalism that is the merit. That the gold medal is the exceptionalism.
Yes, and again, exceptionalism implies that it's a competition, but actually, I don't think we should look at it in terms of competitiveness. We should look at it more in terms of love. This is just the thing that we love. We don't have to justify it, and we don't have to give a standard for it. And it's completely normal, and everyone understands when I say, no, I just really love my country. I just love walking around the green fields of England, and meeting other dog walkers and just saying good morning to them. You don't understand that.
Not because it's better, not because it's a demonstration of supremacy, or
No,
just
yeah,
because
no.
it's me. I belong. It's mine.
Yeah, exactly. It's about belonging. This is ours, and this is the thing. And again, no, we don't have individual ownership of this. And this is one of the things that in the modern day we have very difficult time understanding. There are things that are collectively owned, right? The patrimony of, say, the English people is in the way we say good day to each other. Like, I have to teach Americans when they come to visit to say thank you when someone serves them at a counter, a restaurant or a thing. I have to teach them to say thank you, because in America they're very transactional. If someone's serving you, they're being paid to serve, so I don't have to say anything to them. But in England, we don't think that way. We are thankful that the guy has served us, even though he's being paid, and it's kind. It recognizes the legitimacy and his right to be a part of our culture, to say thank you. And so it seems like a nonsense, like say to thank the bus driver when you get off the bus. He's going to do that anyway. You don't have to thank him, but it's a kind thing to do. And it's one of those aspects of belonging that matter on an emotional and I would say spiritual level to British and particularly English people. this is the way that we do things, and this is the right way that we do things.
I've had a bit of a light bulb moment. Actually, listening to you describe and what you've been saying for the past couple of minutes, your philosophy is the antithesis of racist. It's the antithesis of nationalist, because
Yes.
you're not saying that anyone should forsake their way because there's a better way. You're celebrating the fact that particularisms to different societies are valid because they're particular to that society, and that's it.
And it's why we go on holiday.
Yeah.
It's why you go. It's why you like to travel. It's why, oh, I want to see what they do over there. Yeah, of course you do. It's interesting. Why wouldn't you?
Interestingly, the postmodern elite do a lot of traveling, but they go from one Western hotel chain and one identical airport to another,
They
and
do.
they think they understand other cultures, but they go and eat hamburgers in 3 different continents.
And the only people they meet are people from those cultures who buy into the international liberal paradigm
Yeah,
and so agree with them on that level. They never
and,
speak to the actual people of those countries.
and that's really dangerous because then they go back thinking that they've understood other cultures,
And
and
that everyone's just like us.
yeah, and I understand the world because all the Harvard MBAs I did my MBA with, even though they were born in this country or that country, all think the way I do. Therefore, I understand how the world works. Yeah, I mean,
They were all trained by the same institutions to think in the same way. And the great part about this is that everyone around the world already agrees with this. Like if you go to every other culture, they will feel that way about their own culture. They won't say, "Oh, my culture's perfect" or anything like that. They'll admit that their cultures have problems, like our culture has problems, but they know it's theirs and they understand it and they belong to it and they feel situated when they're in it. And
oh,
this is why, like, you get there's a phenomenon now of second generation and third generation people who are born and raised here thinking I might go back to where my parents came from. Well, why would they ever want to do that? Except they know that there is something about the culture that they feel more situated in. And I mean, why is Idris Elba moving to Africa? Like, why did he choose Africa? Why, oh, yeah, apparently Idris Elba is thinking about retiring to Africa. It's like
where to?
he's probably
Uganda?
London. Sorry,
Uganda? Whereabouts?
I don't know. I can't remember where it was. Just somewhere in Africa. But
Oh,
it's like, why didn't you choose South America or Asia?
yeah.
You're a London-born man. What? Well, because your family's from there. You've got roots there. You've got people who look like you there, and so suddenly, when you realize he feels unsituated in London, right? In Britain, he feels slightly out of place, and it's fine. It's totally normal for him to be like, yeah, no, I'm going to go to that place where I'd feel more at home. I think,
Mhm.
and that's just how I feel living in England, and
Mhm.
how I'm sure Americans feel living in America, and Canadians feel living in Canada.
Mhm.
And one thing that mass immigration looks like from that frame is a horrific scarring of the landscape. Like, how can you do this to us? Like, I walk around my town center at the moment, and it's filled with, it's like the Bazaar of Baghdad. It's every different ethnicity. They're from all over the world. There are loads of Brazilians. There are loads of Bangladeshis. There are loads of Africans. There are loads of East Asians. There are just this mass of people from all over the world. None of them speaking to one another. None of them speak to one another. It's always they stay in their little groups. They're walking along. They don't have any interaction unless they're trading something at a stall or something.
And I doubt that the country they're from, Brazil or the Middle East or India or Africa or wherever it is they're from, I doubt the country that they're from would tolerate the creation of that sort of atomized society in their midst.
No, they're very old world societies and very clannish societies a lot of the time, which is why these people stick together so much. Um, but the fact that this has been done to us, I mean, I've lived in Swindon now. My dad was a forces man, so I didn't grow up in any one place. But my family's from a small town near Swindon, and so I moved back to Swindon after leaving university because I just didn't know what to do with myself. And so I've been here for 25 years, and it used to be just a regular English town. And I would walk through the town centre, and almost everyone would be English. And I would meet loads of friends and family members, and it'd be a complete normal day. I'd see lots of people I know, but they've all gone because of this sort of demographic explosion that's happened here. And now I actually did bump into an old friend a couple of years ago, and he was just like, "Mate, I feel like I'm in a foreign country. I don't feel like I don't understand this. What's happened?" And I was like, "I know."
I
And when
noticed
you
in the short time I've lived in America, when I've visited the UK, I've in 3 or 4 years, I've noticed a significant change. Yeah.
and when you look at it through the sort of lens of belonging, you realize that what you're doing to the people who feel that they belong here is a very cruel thing, and
And
you're really hurting them.
and your elites are pushing the narrative that somehow Britain has always been a ethnically diverse country, and somehow, I saw some recent output by various government ministers, talking about Britain as though Britain today was like this way 50 years ago. I mean, it's the rewriting of history.
Demonstrably false. I mean, we've got the not only do we have plenty of footage of it, we've got the census data. We know that it's not true.
Before we get into talking about how to respond to the failure of mass immigration societies, I just want to finish on this point about the new moral code. So some ways of life are different, and that particularism is of merit. From that, it follows in the new moral code that we're not interchangeable, that there are distinctive things. And therefore, that if you wish to jump the bridge, if you wish to go from living in one country and moving to another, the onus is therefore on you to make those adaptations. I'm afraid I don't yet sound American when I talk, but I celebrate July the 4th very patriotically. Do you think that should be an insistence in the new moral code, that because people are not interchangeable, there is an onus on the new arrival to adopt and to fit in?
100%. I mean, we knew this centuries ago. We have a phrase for it: "When in Rome, you do as the Romans do." It's an ancient trope of the foreigner going native in a different country. Alexander the Great, when he conquered the Persian Empire, got a lot of criticism from his Macedonian soldiers because he began wearing Persian attire. He began dressing like a Persian monarch. And then fast forward sort of Lawrence of Arabia going native with the Arabs and dressing in Arabic clothing, because it is the way that you show the people that you've arrived with that you're on their side and you want to be a part of their community, you want to be a part of their society. It's a way of showing consideration. It's a way of showing loyalty and decency and honor to those people and respecting them. And if you don't do that, you are very disrespectful and you're repudiating them. You're telling them, I don't care about your opinions, and my opinion to me is more important than your opinion to you. And I'm going to impose that upon you. And that's wrong. And we know that's wrong. And we know that's a recipe for disaster. It causes conflict. And we see it everywhere.
We know that mass migration societies in Europe are not succeeding economically. Social trust is declining. Real major problems now. And what's interesting is that occasionally you'll get some sort of midwit politician in Britain or Germany saying, multiculturalism.
Occasionally. Sorry.
Multiculturalism has failed. What I want to talk about is, okay, so what? What are the solutions to this? How might a policy, say, of remigration work? If we adopt a new moral code that accepts that, not all people are the same, and that if you live in a society, you have a duty and an obligation to acclimatize and accommodate and integrate and assimilate. One of the changes I think we would need is something quite specific. At the moment, we have. I'm not a fan of nativism. I've always criticized nativism. When I was a member of Parliament in Britain, I attacked nativism. I don't like the idea of defining someone on the basis of where they were born. The Duke of Wellington once famously said that the fact that someone is born in a stable doesn't make them a horse. The fact that someone is born in the United States or Britain doesn't make them American or British. I feel this particularly strongly as someone who spent a lot of their life living in Uganda, who moved from Britain to America. I feel very strongly that there are things that about America, an outlook, a way of life, an attitude, not just knowing the Pledge of Allegiance, but a whole bunch of stuff that comes with becoming American. And for me, it's a joy to integrate and assimilate. But do we need, perhaps in Europe in particular, a change in the law so that they're no longer nativist? Just because you're born in Germany or Britain just because you're second or third generation doesn't make you British. Do you think that's a, a practical policy response to the failure of multiculturalism, that we begin to undo this sort of nativist legal framework?
So it would be easy to just say yes and therefore. But I think that what that would do is create a slew of potential injustices that actually would be cruel to inflict on people.
Mhm.
And I wouldn't want to be responsible for something like that. So I would prefer to do I would prefer to change things with as light a touch as possible to be as least objectionable, to at least stem the flow at the moment. Because at the moment, our countries are essentially bleeding to death. And so rather than talking about the major surgery, let's at least staunch the wound.
It's a hemorrhage in rather than a hemorrhage out. I mean,
Well, yes, yes, yeah, that's true. But so I mean, were I in charge, the first thing I would do is simply end immigration. I would simply end it. I would dissolve the Home Office, for example, the part of the Home Office that deals with immigration.
would
No,
would you remove imams from mosques and
well,
just
hang on, hang on. So
leave?
the first thing I would do is just end immigration because whatever problem immigration was designed to solve, if I mean at the moment you were going through the statistics. I went through the previous census. In 2021, 1 in 4 people in England was not English. So that's a quarter of England is now not English. That's unprecedented. That's never happened before. And it's an insane thing to have allowed to happen because our major cities are essentially foreign colonies at this point. London is 37% English, Luton is 33% English,
I mean,
Birmingham
that's
is
changed within my
43%
lifetime.
English.
That's changed within my lifetime.
Yeah,
When I
it's
first
changed within the last 20 years. It's crazy. Um, so and whatever the supposed benefits of immigration are, we're somewhere between 10 and 15 million people up at this point, prior to this strange experiment that was began. And if and we are suffering from a crisis of overpopulation. The
when you say
infrastructure is
end immigration, okay, someone like me wants to come and work in the UK, would you say that I'm terribly sorry, you can't, or would you say, if you're from Australia, say you're an Australian and want to go to the UK, okay, if 5,000 Australians go to live in Britain, we will allow that. If 5,000 Britons go and live in Australia, would you make it sort of reciprocal, or would you?
Possibly, and but the important thing at the moment is just to stop the inflow. It there there are going to be small details that you can work out after the fact, but the inflow is the main problem because at the moment the bathtub is overflowing, and we just need to turn off the tap. We have a massive crisis of overpopulation. Everything is feeling just the number of people who are trying to access it. The NHS is failing. The
Yeah,
roads are packed. The trains are so
but
so it just has to be fewer people overall. And so what the way things are working at the moment is I think it was last year there were 1.4 million people who were allowed to come and stay here, and about 800,000 people left. Because hundreds of thousands, there is a large remigration of people anyway. Only about 10% of those are actually British as well. So 90% of the people who leave this country every year permanently are of non-native extraction. And so the most important thing to do at the moment would just be cease the inflow, because then there will be a draining out of the country as those people who are just going to naturally leave anyway, because they do every year, they will leave and there'll be no people coming in to replace them. And so house prices will go down, the roads will clear, the NHS will be able to actually function again. And there will be other consequences to this that they'll say, well, what about pensions? What about this? What about that? Okay, yeah, maybe. But we can't just import millions of people every year to solve that problem. They are problems that are going to have to be solved in some other way. Then to the questions that you're bringing up, the sort of the more pressing ones, as in imams and things like this. Yes, we should absolutely deport foreign criminals, hate preachers, things like that. People who begin from outside of the country or are um, who have dual citizenship somewhere else. Uh, for example, if someone's got a British and Bangladeshi passport and they may have been born in Britain, but they become a radical preacher in a mosque, We should rescind their British passport and send them back to Bangladesh. Absolutely.
So up until now, you talked about stopping net migration,
No, no,
remigration.
absolute migration, not just
Voluntary,
net migration.
voluntary remigration would then mean you get a reduction in the foreign-born population. Now you're talking about an element of compulsion, where you're saying,
Yeah.
I mean, Sweden is just experimenting with the idea of voluntary remigration, where they're offering to pay people
Yep.
thousands of dollars to leave.
Hmm.
But you're suggesting that for certain categories of people, radical imams, people who are criminals, even though they're born in Britain, there should be an element of compulsion.
Yeah, I'm completely fine with someone who has got dual citizenship. And it's important for people to remember, especially Americans, that the old world is not does not have anchor babies. The old world is birthrights, blood citizenship by the blood, not by the birth. So, for example, I grew up in Germany for a large part of my childhood because my dad was in the RF and we had a military base out there. And I had lots of friends who were born on these military bases, but they didn't have German citizenship and they weren't Germans because their parents weren't German. The only way they had German citizenship is if their mum or their dad was German. Because in the old world, your citizenship is inherited. It's actually not just given out by the square foot of land that you were born into. And so this is something that we've been very frivolous with as well. We've got an informal form of birthright citizenship where if a person is born in Britain and their parent has a British passport, then they have a British passport as well. But again, this is not something that is this is something the government does, not that I think it's a legal requirement. Although fact check me on that. But the point being is that the way that old world countries work is that you inherit your citizenship and your passport. So, for example, Shamima Begum, when Bangladesh refuses to take her back, that's Bangladesh in the wrong because she has a blood claim to
She's
that.
a British-born woman or young lady of Bangladeshi origin who
Yes,
went off and colluded with
she
ISIS.
joined ISIS.
She joined a terrorist organization in the Middle East. The British government said, "We're stripping you of your citizenship. Get out.
Yes.
Rather, don't come back." Now, remind me, did she have a British passport and a Bangladeshi passport, or just a British passport?
I believe she just had a British passport, but because she is Bangladeshi heritage, she's entitled to a Bangladeshi passport, which Bangladesh refused to issue to her, leaving her stateless. This puts Bangladesh in the wrong in this situation. Although, of course, many bleeding heart liberals would say, "Oh, she's British. She's as British as anyone. Bring her home." And it's like, no, we don't. We don't have to. She's not British by birth, by blood. She's only British by birth. We're not a
That's
birthright citizenship country.
that's a very important precedent. I
Mm.
mean, the old school, forgive me, the old school John Locke liberal would hate the idea of the British state being able to strip someone of citizenship. I now wonder if maybe actually you do need to strip people of citizenship, and
Well, we
I
do.
want to
We
discuss
do.
what that might entail, what some of the key litmus
Mm.
tests might be for that.
No, no, we do. We do. The British state does have the power to strip people of citizenship. That's absolutely correct. And we should use it on people who are, say, criminals and things like that.
What
Uh,
about what about? I mean, I let's be blunt about it. There's one type of migrant living in Britain who I think is far more high risk to the social cohesion of the state, and those are
I can guess.
not Muslim but Islamist, those who believe in the teachings of Sayyid Qutb and the Muslim Brotherhood, the politicization of Islam as a religion of activism rather than as a philosophical system.
Mm.
Um, if if you ignore this and you're the authorities, you're going to end up having to lock up, people like Tommy Robinson and what have you, because they point out this embarrassing fact that there are now significant numbers of people living in Britain who have all the rights of British citizenship, but who fundamentally are Islamist and a risk to the country. If you eventually, and I think, I don't know how many Manchester Arena bombings it's going to take, eventually people will wake up to this and recognize something needs to be done. One proposal when that moment comes, I would suggest, is that if if you believe that someone who commits apostasy, that is, who renounces their faith, whether their faith is atheism or Christianity or Islam or Judaism, whatever, if you believe that harm should come to someone who renounces their religion, maybe that should be the litmus test. Maybe that's the point at which the British state should say, do you know what? If you wish harm to people who renounce their religion, you yourself cannot be a member of this society, and you need to be stripped of citizenship. Might that be one way of addressing it? Should you create maybe some kind of litmus test like that?
I think it's unlikely because anyone when professing beliefs or attesting faith can just lie. They could just tell you what you want to hear, and it's only when they've actually blown up a bunch of children that you realize that that person wasn't telling you the truth.
Well,
So
but you can. I mean, the evidence can be in the recording of the sermon, or it can be in the
it can, yeah,
uploaded on social media.
it can, but then you're demanding an ever more intrusive state, and it will be accused of being Islamophobic and bigoted, and you run into a whole suite of problems. I'm not saying that I've got a good solution for this either, and it may well be necessary at some point in time to do this in the future. Again, it's really not my preference to do something like that. But I mean, anyone, it's totally fine to have a bar where an action has been taken that you consider disqualifying for an immigrant or someone who's descended from immigrants to live in this country. Right? That's totally fine, and I think that's completely acceptable. And we do it all the time. When it comes to foreign hate preachers, we deport them. We bar them from coming in the country. Oh yeah, absolutely.
How many?
Um,
How many? Well, it's probably unfair for me to ask you, but I'd be
I don't know the
know
number,
how
but
many hate
I
preachers have
can.
been removed.
There are, I mean, there are people like Nakia Zyke, I think it is, who are banned from coming in, and it goes the other way as well. I mean, Canadian activist Lauren Southern has been banned from Britain for being a hate preacher,
but,
just not for Islam.
but Carl, this is what happens. These laws are passed, and we're told that it's to tackle terrorism. And then, of course, the British state, terrified of being accused of Islamophobia, has to have a quota of so-called sort of right
It
wingers.
does,
And so
yeah,
it ends up going after right wingers with anti-terror
precisely.
legislation. I think you saw this in Canada with the truckers. I mean,
Yeah. Well, it's
legislation.
happened to Tommy Robinson. I mean, the reason he's in jail is because he refused to open his phone under counterterrorism legislation, and because he showed a movie. So that they're already using those things against people who are obviously not terrorists. Lauren Southern being another one of those. So we do use those things. The problem is, of course, the people in charge of the state. But ultimately, it is the British people who have the power of selection as to who becomes the government. We like to say things like, "Oh, well, democracy doesn't really work," or "democracy is." Well, we're the ones choosing it. We could choose a different set of parties if we wanted. For some reason, people will just only vote for Labour or bloody Conservative, though. So I don't,
Well, to be
don't know what to
fair,
do.
I mean, until very, very, very recently, Carl, you and I could not have had a conversation like we certainly could never have had a conversation on any state-controlled medium in the UK.
Absolutely,
We would have been, if you and I were discussing anything like this on the BBC, it would have been instant,
it
you know,
just would never have arrived there.
I spent 12 years in the House of Commons. If I had dared to articulate any of these thoughts at the time, I would have been verboten. I would have been, the entire system would have silenced me. But I think maybe now is the time to have these thoughts and to say, okay, if multiculturalism has failed, what do we do about it? You know, at what point do you say that the state has to use compulsion? I mean, I think clearly there has to be some kind of litmus test. You talked about the need to remove hate imams. I think that's a good start. I would define one element of a hate imam as an imam who advocates for ill will on people who renounce their faith. Now, the
Oh
reason
yeah,
I think it's incredibly important is because in the West we have this idea of religious freedom, quite rightly. George Washington writing that letter to the Jewish congregation in Newport in, I think, 1791. We tend to think of religious liberty as freedom of people to practice their religion from menace from the state. The issue of our time is not menace from the state, it's menace from ideologues within society who demand that their religion is the only and the absolute and the final revelation and the final truth. Now, how do you
Well,
preserve?
hang on, just a quick point on that. I mean, every person who's religious believes that, right? They all believe that, but the particularly
No,
English view.
not the final revelation. I don't think Christians believe it was the
Well,
final.
they believe it is the proper truth of
Yeah, but
religion, right?
there's something specific
Well,
to Islam because the
sure,
way
and I don't want to go on for the weeks. That's not really what I was trying to address. But the point being, the context in which English religious toleration arose was shortly after the Protestant Reformation, after the wars of religion, and in a Christian context. So when we said quote religious toleration, what we really meant was toleration of Christian denominations. And some of these denominations were quite crazy of their own. The Anabaptists, for example, are absolutely bonkers. But the point being, the state wasn't going to preference or privilege or persecute, which mainly persecute people for their sincere professions of faith. And when you have a gentle religion like Christianity, that makes a lot of sense because, okay, very few Christians actually want to kill. Very few of them. And like I said, you had a few bonkers Anabaptists in the 16th century. But since then, it's very difficult actually to identify a Christian movement that wants to kill someone. Uh, that's not a universal religious perspective. Not all religions agree with that. In fact, many religions completely disagree with that. And I'm not just singling out Islam on that. There are other religions that are also violent. So it is something that we, again, have universalized without understanding the particular differences between our culture and other people's culture.
fascinating, fascinating. Okay, so do you have any other thoughts about how we might, okay, we're going to hear Kemi Badenoch has just been announced as the new Conservative leader. I would say one of the reasons why she got the job was because she said very famously in a couple of speeches a few years ago, you know, multiculturalism has failed. Actually, she's an immigrant who's arrived in the UK and is proud of the things that are distinctive about Britain. Okay, great speech.
Yep.
We could, have an extra bank holiday and call it, I don't know, British Patriot Day. We could, do all those kind of state-led symbolic things. But what, in terms of public policy, could actually be done to undo the damage of mass uncontrolled immigration with a sort of postmodern elite who's made no effort to integrate? What specifics do you think someone like her needs to come up with?
I don't think she's going to do all that much regarding it. Again, if I was able to give her a list of things to enact, I would say, well, look, you just have to stop immigration at this point. It's the numbers primarily that are the issue. Cultural issues from individual groups are, of course, something downstream from that, but it has to be the numbers primarily. But also, I mean, coming back to the question of collective ownership, the question ought to be raised to anyone, not just Kemi Badenoch. To whom does England belong? And there is a very sensible answer to this that everyone knows. For example, if I would say, well, to whom does Indonesia belong? Someone will say, well, the Indonesians, obviously. That's the very purpose of national sovereignty, that the people who make up that ethnic group have the state of their own. To whom does Israel belong? The Israelis, obviously. So to whom does England belong? And you know the answer to that, but it's a forbidden answer because the question ought never to be raised. Because if we raise it, we realize the tremendous injustice that's been done to us, and people would probably get quite angry about that. So that's really the premise that we've got to begin with to have a different moral framework with which to deal with these things. Like I'm saying, like I said, I don't think we need to be excessively exclusionary, actually. And anyone who's say married into a British family, of course, you become part of the thing by integrating in that way. And historically, intermarriage was literally the way you integrated. I think it was Paraguay banned intra-racial marriage, as in Spanish people weren't allowed to marry Spanish people; they had to marry natives in Paraguay. in order to solve this problem. So a generation or two later, there were Paraguayans rather than Spaniards and Indians.
I think
And
love and
I,
human nature is the long-term solution to this.
I'm not saying we need to go that far, but that is a reasonable standard. No, you need to marry a British person if you want to stay, right? That is a reasonable standard that we should look at least vocalizing. I'm not necessarily saying that anything needs to be done in law because, as I said earlier, I'd really like everything to be done with a light touch,
That's
right?
what
A
I worry
light,
about. I worry about that state laws and edicts and state-sponsored deportation would have horrible. It would be a sledgehammer that would miss a
I
nut.
don't like it. I don't like it. And again, maybe it's just because I'm an Englishman. Maybe it's because I'm an ex-liberal or I've got libertarian sympathies and things like that. But I don't want the state coming down like a sledgehammer on anything. But there are very definite things that the state can do, and it doesn't have to be a very hard physical. You know, the iron fist doesn't have to come out of the velvet glove. It could be ma- people who are married to a British person or who are British themselves get some sort of tax break or something like that. You know, something to show that no, you are the people who really matter in the country because you are who the country belongs to. You are the country. You know, if it's not just a geographic area that can be divvied up on a spreadsheet and put into numeric categories.
Not just cucumber sandwiches and tweet pictures of
No,
cards above
yeah,
me. We're a people.
yeah.
We're
But anything that was done, I would like it to be as light a touch as possible, and really violating as few rights as possible as well. That I think that really is very important. Which is why simply saying no and preventing people from coming would be a massive step in the right direction. And honestly, I bet half of the problems that we have would be solved by simply stopping people from coming. I really think after 5 years, you'd notice that hang on a second, about 3.5 million people have left, and so I can get an appointment with the NHS again. The house prices would go down dramatically. You know, the things would change in a very, very substantive way, and people would start feeling good about their own country again.
I wonder if even just having conversations like you and I are having, normalizing, mainstreaming these ideas, legitimizing the idea that concern about the future of a country and the consequences of mass uncontrolled immigration, and normalizing this. I wonder if that's a big part of it. I wonder if actually the country will get off its knees if people start to even just debate and think about these things.
All change begins with a change of consciousness. So without this kind of dialogue, it wouldn't be possible. Which is honestly why I agreed to have this conversation with you in the first place.
Carl, I have to say I'm not 100% sure on where I stand on some of these issues. I'm a John Locke conservative who is perhaps moving beyond the sort of traditional conservative ideas, but it's been absolutely riveting and fascinating talking to you. And I've learned a lot, and I hope people listening to this have learned a lot. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time. I really, really appreciate it.
Honestly, it's my pleasure. And I just want to be clear. I'm not entirely sure where I stand either. I did a degree in philosophy, and this is basically what I've come out as at the end of it, being like, okay, well, all of this ideology is bad. What else do we have? And so this is all new territory for me as well. And I don't want to roam into territory that's particularly hard edged and aggressive and vindictive or anything like that. That's not what I'm personally like, and I want to avoid all of that.
I think the point you made earlier about rejecting very firmly the idea of determinism,
Hmm.
uh, and saying that yes, certain cultures and certain environments and certain other factors may predispose people, but we're all free people. We're all, as Judeo-Christians might say, unique individuals made in the image of God. We all have free will. We all have
We're all
choice.
moral agents. We all get to choose the things that we do. And I really do believe that as well.
I think if we cling to that, the
Mm,
conversation can't go wrong. You can't end up in
mm,
a horrible, nasty, extremist
mm.
place you don't want to end up in if you stick to that basic thing. So thank you so much for
My pleasure, honestly.
really appreciate it. Thank you.